Yo fam, welcome to the channel. Glad you pulled up tonight. Before we dive in, I want to set the vibe straight. This ain't just a story, it's confession, it's survival, it's the kind of truth that cuts deep and leaves scars. So lean in and listen close, because I ain't proud of what I did, but I gotta spill it. I kept a secret, a heavy one, the kind of secret that could flip a whole marriage upside down. The kind of secret that could make or break the trust between two people who swore to stand by each other forever. And I never told her mama, never told anybody that the apartment we were moving into was mine, bought with my own grind, my own sweat, my own late nights hustling and stacking every dollar I could scrape together. And I let her think it was rented because I knew how people move, I knew how families creep in, I knew how control gets snatched piece by piece until you don't even recognize your own life anymore. And I wasn't about to play myself like that. She was beautiful, no cap, soft voice, sharp mind, eyes that could slice through steel, but her family? Man, they were slick, always talking about joint decisions, shared space, equal rights, but I could feel it, that vibe, that slow creep of control, that energy that says we're gonna take over, we're gonna make this ours, and I wasn't having it. First night in the apartment, she walked in like she owned the place, started rearranging furniture, tossing my books, moving my prayer mat, didn't ask, didn't blink, just did it, and I watched, silent, smiling fake, but inside I was like, damn, this ain't even day one and she already set in the tone. Her mom came over the next day, high heels clicking like she was stepping into a courtroom, looked around, sniffed like she smelled broke, then said, "This place needs a woman's touch," and I nodded, but in my head I was screaming because I knew what that meant. I knew it was the start of something I didn't sign up for. Weeks passed, she started bringing her cousins over, late nights, loud laughs, my peace gone. I'd come home from work, tired as hell, and find my living room turned into a freaking salon, hair dryers, makeup kits, gossip flying like bullets, and me just trying to breathe, trying to hold on to the little bit of sanity I had left. One night I walked in and saw her cousin sitting on my couch wearing my hoodie, the one my dad gave me before he passed, and I lost it. I didn't yell, didn't fight, just walked into my room, locked the door, and stared at the ceiling, because that's when it hit me. I was losing my space, my soul, my sanity, and they didn't even know it was mine. I kept quiet, played the role, smiled at dinners, laughed at dumb jokes, but inside I was building walls nobody could see, walls that kept me from breaking down, walls that held back the storm that was brewing inside me. Then came the day she said, "Let's renovate, tear down this wall, open up the space," and I looked at her, dead in the eyes, and said, "Nah, this wall stays," and she frowned. "Why, it's just a wall," and I leaned back, "It's my wall, my house, my rules," and silence dropped heavy, her face froze, her mom blinked, her cousin dropped her phone, and I stood up, walked to the drawer, pulled out the papers, ownership, my name, my blood, and laid them on the table, and the air shifted, the vibe cracked, the truth spilled out like thunder. She didn't speak, not that day, not the next, but the vibe? It shifted, the energy changed, the control they thought they had slipped through their fingers like sand, and I ain't saying I won, I ain't saying I flexed, but I protected my peace, my space, my truth, and you know what? Thank God I kept that secret, because if I hadn't, I'd be sleeping on the floor of my own damn house, watching my life get rewritten by people who didn't earn it, didn't bleed for it, didn't sacrifice for it. And that's the thing about secrets, sometimes they ain't about lies, sometimes they're about survival, about keeping a piece of yourself safe from the world, about protecting the little corner of your soul that nobody else gets to touch, and that's what I did. I protected mine, and I'll never regret it. So fam, that's the beginning of this ride, and I want to know, have you ever kept a secret to protect your peace? Have you ever held something back because you knew the world would twist it if you let it out? Drop it in the comments, let me know. Because this ain't just my story, it's ours, it's a mirror, it's a warning, it's a confession, and next time the storm gets louder when she says, "This house is ours," and the battle for space turns into a war for identity, she thought it was just a wall, just bricks and paint, but nah, it was history, it was memory, it was my mother's prayers pressed into silence, it was the one place in that apartment that held me together when the world was trying to rip me apart, and I remember sitting against that wall as a kid, my mom whispering words of faith, her hands raised, her tears falling like rain, and me just watchin', feelin' the weight of her belief, the strength of her love, the kind of energy that makes you believe you can survive anything. And that wall wasn't just a wall, it was a shield, it was a witness, it was the only thing that knew the battles I fought alone, the nights I cried myself to sleep, the mornings I woke up with fire in my chest but no one to tell. And so when she said, "Let's renovate, let's open up the space," I felt like she was trying to erase my mother, erase my past, erase the one thing that kept me sane, and I couldn't let that happen. Nights got heavier, arguments got sharper, her family kept pushing, saying, "Modernize, upgrade, make it fresh," but I knew what they didn't. I knew that wall was the reason I hadn't broken yet. I knew it was the anchor that kept me from drowning in the chaos of this marriage. I'd sit there late at night, lights off, just me in the silence, leaning my head against the cold plaster, hearing echoes of my mom's voice, "Stay strong, life will test you but don't let it break you." And I swear I could feel her hand on my shoulder even though she was long gone, and that wall became my confessional, my therapy, my anchor, and every time I thought about losing it, my chest tightened like I was suffocating. She didn't get it, she thought it was just stubbornness, just me being hard-headed, but nah, it was deeper, it was blood deep, soul deep, and I wasn't about to explain it to people who only saw surface. One night, after another fight, I sat there against the wall and I started talking to it like it was alive, like it could hear me, and maybe it could, maybe walls got memory, maybe they hold the energy of the people who lean on them, cry on them, pray against them, and I told it, "Don't worry, I ain't letting them take you, you're all I got left of her." And fam, I swear the air shifted, like the room itself was listening, like the house was breathing with me, and I felt less alone. Days turned into weeks, tension grew, she stopped cooking, her mom stopped visiting, her cousins stopped Logan, but I didn't care, because I was fighting for something bigger than furniture, bigger than paint. I was fighting for my mother's spirit, and every time I leaned against that wall I felt her strength flowing back into me. Then came the night she snapped, slammed the door, screamed, "It's just a wall, why are you acting like it's life or death?" And I looked at her, eyes burning, voice low, and said, "Because it is, because that wall is the only thing keeping me alive in this house, the only thing reminding me who I am, the only thing that still carries her prayers. And if you tear it down you tear me down with it." And silence hit harder than any slap. She froze, her anger melted into confusion, maybe even fear, and for the first time she saw me, not the husband, not the provider, not the man playing strong, but the son, the broken kid still holding onto his mama's whispers. She didn't say a word, just walked away, and I sat there, leaning against the wall, crying like I hadn't cried in years, crying for her, crying for me, crying for the battles nobody ever saw. And that wall wasn't just mine, it was hers too, it was ours. It was the bridge between past and present, and I wasn't letting anybody touch it. Secrets ain't always lies, sometimes they're shields, sometimes they're survival, and if you've ever had something in your life that kept you going when the world was trying to break you, you know exactly what I mean. You know the weight of protecting something sacred, you know the fear of losing the only thing that keeps you standing, and I swear every time I pressed my back against that wall I felt my mom's prayers holding me up, like invisible arms keeping me from falling, and I realized that maybe I wasn't just protecting a wall, maybe I was protecting the last piece of myself that hadn't been stolen. Maybe I was protecting the boy I used to be, the son who believed his mother's words could shield him from anything, and that's why I couldn't let it go, that's why I fought, that's why I stayed stubborn. Because some things ain't meant to be redesigned, some things ain't meant to be modernized, some things are sacred, and if you lose them you lose yourself. So I held on, I dug in, I made that wall my line in the sand, and I knew the battle wasn't over, I knew the storm was still coming, but at least I had drawn my boundary, at least I had said, this far and no further. And fam, that's survival, that's truth, that's the kind of fight you don't win with fists or words but with silence, with presence, with refusal to break, and I ain't ashamed of it. I ain't ashamed of protecting my peace, my memory, my mother's prayers, because without that wall I'd be lost, without that wall I'd be sleeping on the floor of my own damn house, erased, invisible, forgotten, and I refused to let that happen. She looked me dead in the eyes one night and said, "This house is ours," and fam, those words hit me like a punch to the chest, because I knew what she meant. I knew it wasn't just about walls or furniture or paint, it was about control, it was about ownership, It was about erasing the grind I put in, the sweat I poured out, the nights I stayed up hustling just to make sure this place was mine. And now she was claiming it like it was a gift handed to her, like it was a prize she won by showing up, and I couldn't let that slide. I sat there, quiet, letting her words echo in the room, letting them bounce off the walls that had heard my prayers, my cries, my silence, and I thought about how easy it is for people to rewrite your story if you don't stand up, how easy it is for them to take what you bled for and call it theirs, and I felt the fire rise in me. She kept talking, saying we'll redesign, we'll make it modern, we'll open it up, it's ours now, and I leaned back, watching her face, watching the confidence in her tone, and I realized she didn't even know the weight of what she was saying. She didn't know she was standing on ground built from my sacrifice. She didn't know she was trying to plant her flag in soil watered by my blood. I wanted to yell, I wanted to scream, but instead I stayed calm, because sometimes silence is louder than rage, sometimes quiet is sharper than words, and I let her finish. Then I said, "Not, this house ain't ours, this house is mine, and you live here because I let you, not because you own it." And the room froze, her eyes widened, her lips parted, but no sound came out, and I knew I had cracked something inside her. She tried to laugh it off, tried to say, "Don't be dramatic, marriage is about sharing," but I wasn't buying it, because I knew what sharing meant in her language. It meant talking, it meant claiming, it meant slowly erasing me until I was just a shadow in my own home, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Her mom came over the next day, strutting in like she was the judge of some courtroom, looking around with that same sniff of superiority, and she said, "Beta, you must understand, a house becomes a home when a woman takes charge," and I smiled fake, nodded polite, but inside I was screaming, because I knew what she was doing. I knew she was planting seeds in her daughter's head, seeds of control, seeds of dominance, seeds that would grow into vines wrapped pin around my throat if I didn't cut them out early. Nights got colder, conversations got shorter, laughter disappeared, and all that was left was tension, heavy like smoke, suffocating me every time I walked through the door. I'd sit in the living room, watching her rearrange things, moving my books, replacing my pictures, adding her touch everywhere, and I felt like a stranger in my own space, like I was being erased piece by piece. And the worst part? She didn't even notice. She thought it was normal, she thought it was love, she thought it was partnership, but to me it was invasion, it was theft, it was betrayal. One night I came home late, exhausted, and found her cousins lounging on my couch, lobing, eating, acting like they owned the place, and I stood there, watching them, feeling the rage boil inside me, but I didn't say a word. I just walked past, locked myself in my room, and stared at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep this up, wondering how long before I snapped. She knocked on the door later, soft voice, saying, "Why you actin' distant, this is our house, our family," and I whispered back, "No, this is my house, my family ain't here, my family is gone, and you don't get to rewrite that." And she went silent, footsteps fading, and I knew she was hurt, but I also knew she needed to hear it. Days turned into weeks, the tension grew thicker, and every time she said ours I felt like she was stabbing me. Every time she claimed what wasn't hers I felt like I was losing ground, and I realized this wasn't just about a house, it was about identity, it was about survival, it was about me holding on to the last piece of myself that hadn't been stolen. I thought about my mom, thought about her prayers, thought about the night she told me, "Don't let the world break you, don't let them take what's yours," and I knew I had to fight, I knew I had to stand firm, even if it meant breaking the peace, even if it meant facing the storm head on. So I drew my line, I made my stand, I told her straight, "This house is mine, and if you can't respect that, then maybe you don't belong here." And the words hung heavy, cutting through the silence like a blade, and she stared at me, eyes wide, fear mixed in with anger, confusion mixed in with pride, and I knew the battle had begun. She didn't speak, not that night, not the next, but the vibe shifted, the air grew colder, the distance grew wider, and I felt the storm building, felt the thunder rumbling beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. And fam, that's the truth. Sometimes the fight ain't about fists or screams, sometimes it's about standing your ground, protecting your identity, refusing to be erased, and that's what I did. I stood firm, I held on, I refused to let her words rewrite my story, because this house ain't ours, this house is mine, and I'll die protecting it if I have to. A first night in that house felt like a movie scene gone wrong, the kind of night you replay in your head and still can't believe you lived through. And I remember every little detail like it's tattooed on my skin, the way the streetlight cut through the blinds, the hum of the fridge like a distant radio, the smell of takeout left on the counter, and the silence that sat heavy between us like a third person at the table, because we just moved in and everything should have been new and bright, but instead it felt fragile, like glass you could step on and cut yourself. And she was smiling, small, trying to make it cozy, but there was this edge to her laugh that didn't belong, like someone practicing happiness in front of a mirror. And I watched her hang a picture where my dad's used to be and felt a cold twist in my gut. We've been married a few months, everyone's saying congrats and you two are perfect, but perfection is a lie people tell to keep the noise down. And that night the first crack in the silence showed up like a hairline fracture in a windshield, tiny at first, almost invisible, but you know it's gonna spider out and ruin the whole view. She asked me to help with the boxes and I said yeah, but my hands were heavy with something else, a secret I'd been carrying like a stone in my pocket. And when I opened the box with my old records, she picked one up, ran her fingers over the sleeve, and said, "You still got these?" Like it was cute, like it was nostalgia. And I smiled, but my smile was thin because those records were the last things my dad touched before he left, the last soundtrack to a life that taught me how to be quiet and how to fight without making noise. She put the record on the shelf and then, casual as a breeze, she said, "We should invite my cousins over tomorrow, make it a housewarming." And the words landed like a match on dry wood, small, careless, but enough to start a blaze. I felt something inside me tighten, like a wire pulled taut, because housewarming to her meant a parade of people who'd treat my living room like a public square, who'd sit on my couch like it belonged to them, who'd rearrange my life with the same ease they rearranged throw pillows. And I didn't say anything at first because I was trying to be the man who keeps peace, the man who doesn't make storms out of clouds. But peace ain't worth much when it costs you your home. That night, after she fell asleep, I walked the apartment alone, barefoot on the cold floor, touching the walls like I was checking for cracks, whispering to myself the names of the things I'd built: rent checks, overtime shifts, the nights I skipped sleep to stack cash. And I felt the weight of ownership like a secret prayer, something sacred I hadn't told her because I wanted to protect it from being turned into a bargaining chip. I sat on the couch and stared at the ceiling until the sun started to think about rising, and in that quiet hour I heard the first real sound of the house changing, a laugh from the hallway, a muffled voice, the echo of someone who didn't belong yet already felt at home. And I realized the crack wasn't just in the silence, it was in me, in the idea that I could keep everything together by staying silent. Morning came and she was already up, humming, making coffee like nothing was wrong, and she kissed me on the cheek with that soft, practiced affection that hides 1,000 small decisions. And I wanted to tell her everything, about the papers in my drawer, about the nights I worked 2 jobs, about the way my hands shook when I signed the deed, but I swallowed it down because I'd promised myself I'd protect this place without drama, without spectacle, and sometimes protection looks like secrecy. The cousins arrived in the living room filled with voices, with shoes by the door, with the smell of perfume and the clink of glasses, and I watched them move through my space like they were mapping it for future occupation, laughing loud, sitting where I used to sit, and I felt a slow burn of anger that wasn't loud but it was steady, like a coal under the skin. She laughed with them, leaned into their jokes, and I could see the way her shoulders relaxed when she was surrounded by her people, like she'd found a tribe that validated her. And I wanted to be happy for her, I wanted to be the guy who welcomed her joy, but the joy came at the cost of my quiet, my rituals, the small things that made this house mine. At one point her cousin grabbed my hoodie off the back of a chair and put it on like it was a trophy, and I felt something inside me snap, not a shout, not a fight, but a hollow, echoing hurt that made me step outside and breathe like I was trying to pull air into lungs that had been underwater too long. I walked the block, hands in my pockets, the city moving around me like a film I wasn't in, and I thought about the first night my mom taught me to pray, how she'd press her palms together and whisper for protection, and I realized I'd been praying too, in my own way, praying that the house would stay mine, that the memories wouldn't be bulldozed by other people's laughter. When I came back, the party was winding down, the cousins were leaving with hugs and promises to come back, and she was standing in the doorway, eyes soft, like she'd been waiting for me to return to the script she'd written for us, and she said, "You okay?" like it was a casual line, and I wanted to tell her the truth, that I felt erased, that my hoodie on someone else's shoulders felt like a theft, but I didn't want to be the guy who made her family feel unwelcome, so I lied and said I was tired, that work had me beat, and she nodded and kissed my forehead, and the kiss felt like a bandage over a wound that needed stitches. That night, alone again, I sat against the wall I'd refused to tear down, the wall that held my mother's prayers and the echo of my father's laugh, and I let the silence speak for me, because sometimes silence is the only language left when words have been used up, and I promised myself I wouldn't let the first crack become a canyon. The first night taught me that boundaries are not just lines on paper, they're the small, stubborn acts of saying no to the slow theft of your life, and it taught me that sometimes the people you love will be the ones who start the erosion, not out of malice but out of habit, out of a hunger to belong, and you gotta decide if you're gonna let them belong at the cost of losing yourself. I didn't know then how loud the next fights would be, or how many nights I'd spend counting the breaths between us, but I knew this. The silence had been broken, the first crack had shown, and from that night on nothing would be the same. They thought the house was a playground and my room was the VIP lounge they could crash anytime, and it started small, her cousin borrowing my charger, her aunt leaving a stack of magazines on my nightstand like they owned the nightstand, but it didn't stay small, it grew like mold, slow and invisible until one day the whole place smelled different and I woke up in a life I didn't recognize. It was late when I first noticed the pattern: shoes by the door that weren't ours, towels in the bathroom that didn't belong to me, a toothbrush in the cup that had never been mine, and every little thing felt like a breadcrumb trail leading to a takeover. I'd come home from work, keys in my hand, and the hallway would be full of voices, laughter that didn't include me, and I'd stand there like a ghost at my own welcome party, watching them map my life with their footsteps. The worst was when they started treating my room like a guest suite, walking in without knocking, plopping on my bed, scrolling through my playlists like they were curators of my taste, and I'd feel this cold, quiet rage that didn't explode but settled in my chest like a stone. One night I found her cousin sleeping in my bed, hoodie pulled up, my hoodie draped over the back of the chair, and I didn't knock, I didn't shout, I just stood in the doorway and watched him breathe like he owned the rhythm of my house. And that's when I realized the scheme wasn't accidental, it was strategic, slow encroachment, normalization of presence, the kind of takeover that happens with smiles and invitations and were family lines that hide the real plan. They'd come over for help with the kitchen, help with the laundry, and while they were helping they were setting up camp, leaving things behind, making themselves comfortable, and every time I asked them to pick up after themselves I got the same look: surprised, offended, like I was the rude one for expecting boundaries in my own house. Her mom was the ringmaster, always polite, always smiling, but there was a cold calculation behind those eyes, a way she'd compliment me that felt like a probe. "You work so hard, Beta, you deserve rest," she'd say, and I'd nod, but the compliment came with a price: gratitude that turned into obligation, obligation that turned into permission for them to be everywhere. They started leaving keys with her, in case we need to water the plants, and I'd find the spare key on the counter like a loaded gun, and every time I moved it I felt like I was playing defense in my own home. I tried to be the man who kept peace, the guy who didn't make mountains out of molehills, but peace ain't worth much when it costs you your privacy, and privacy ain't a luxury, it's a line in the sand. One afternoon I came back early from work and heard voices in my room, so I walked in and found them sitting cross-legged on my floor, Logan, passing around my old photos like they were props in a show, and I felt something inside me break a little. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't slam doors, I just stood there, and the room got quiet like someone had turned down the world, and I said, "Hey, this is my room," and they looked up like I'd interrupted a movie, like I'd ruined the vibe. And her cousin shrugged. "Chill, man, we're family," and that word family was used like a shield, like a legal document that erased consent. It wasn't just the stuff, it was the stories they started telling about me when I wasn't around, little narratives that painted me as distant, as cold, as the guy who didn't appreciate the warmth they brought, and people believed it because it was easier to accept a simple story than to ask hard questions. Her mom would call me quiet in front of guests, like it was a diagnosis. And then she'd tell my wife, he's so reserved, maybe he needs more time to open up, and I'd watch my wife soften, see her start to doubt the man she married, and I knew the scheme had a second layer, not just physical occupation, but emotional colonization, plant doubt, harvest control. I started locking my door, small rebellions at first, and they'd knock like it was a joke, like I was being dramatic, and I'd answer through the door, give me my space, and they'd laugh and move on. But the laughter was the worst part because it made me feel like the crazy one for wanting a room that belonged to me. Then came the night they crossed the line I couldn't ignore. Her cousin took my old journal off the shelf and started reading passages out loud, smirking like he'd found treasure, and I felt my skin crawl because those pages were the map of my private life, the raw drafts of my grief and my dreams, and to hear them turned into jokes was like watching my insides get displayed on a stage. I grabbed the journal back, hands shaking, and I didn't yell, I didn't curse, I just said, don't touch my stuff, and the room went still, like someone had cut the music, and her mom said, we're family, we can share, and I realized then that sharing had been weaponized, presented as virtue while it functioned as erasure. I started leaving notes on my door, small, polite, please knock, but notes don't stop people who feel entitled, and entitlement is a dangerous thing when it's backed by a chorus of relatives who all nod and smile and say, it's fine, he's overreacting. I tried to talk to my wife, calm, measured, explaining how it felt to have my room treated like a common area, and she'd look at me with that tired look, like she was stuck between two truths, and sometimes she'd say, they're just family, and sometimes she'd say, I didn't know, and both answers cut different ways, one was dismissal, the other was guilt, and neither fixed the problem. The scheme reached my room like a tide, slow and inevitable, and I found myself sleeping with one eye open, listening for footsteps, for the sound of someone moving through my life, and it changed me, made me smaller, made me quieter, made me start to measure my words before I said them. But there's a point where silence becomes surrender, and I hit that point one night when her cousin left a pair of shoes by my bed and a half-empty bottle of cologne on my dresser, and I snapped, not with a shout but with a plan. I started reclaiming my space in small, deliberate ways. I moved my father's picture to the center of the shelf, I put my records back on the stand where they belonged, I locked the spare key in a drawer and told her, calmly, no more keys. It wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, and it worked because it forced a conversation they couldn't laugh off. Her mom came over, eyebrows raised, and I said, steady, this is my room. Respect it. She tried the old lines, we're family, you should be more welcoming, but I held my ground, and for the first time I saw the mask slip. Behind the politeness was surprise, then annoyance, then a grudging respect, because people respect boundaries when they see you mean them. The battle wasn't won that night, but the line was drawn, and once you draw a line you can't unsee it. They still came around, still left traces, but the room stopped being a free-for-all, it became a place with rules, and rules are the language of ownership. I learned that schemes can be dismantled not with anger but with consistency, with the quiet repetition of this is mine until the world accepts it, and I learned that family can be a fortress or a siege depending on who holds the gate. I stayed quiet for a long time, thinking silence would be my shield, thinking if I kept my mouth shut the storm would pass, but silence turned out to be a loud thing in that house. It echoed off the ceilings and filled the rooms with a pressure that made my chest ache, and every quiet moment felt like a verdict being written against me. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee gone cold, watching her laugh across the room with people who treated my life like a sitcom, and I'd remind myself I was protecting something, my name on the deed, the nights I worked 2 jobs, the memory of my mom, but protection started to feel like hiding, and hiding started to feel like losing. People think staying quiet is noble, like you're the bigger person, but there's a difference between being big and being invisible, and I was slipping into the latter, a ghost in my own home. The walls heard everything, my prayers, my curses, the small sobs I tried to swallow at 3 a.m., and sometimes I'd press my palm flat against the plaster and whisper to it like it was a friend, remember this, don't let them take it, because the house had become the only witness that still knew the truth of me. She'd walk past humming, dropping little changes like confetti, new cushions, a different lamp, a throw that matched her cousin's Instagram aesthetic, and each change felt like a tiny erasure, a soft theft that added up until I couldn't find the edges of myself anymore. I started measuring my days by the invasions: who left shoes by the door, who used my mug, who sat in my chair, and it got to the point where I'd rehearse conversations in my head before I even opened my mouth, because every word could be turned into a story they'd tell later, a story that painted me as the problem. The worst part was how they weaponized kindness. Compliments came wrapped in expectations: you work so hard, beta, meant you owed them your silence; let us help, meant they'd move in piece by piece until the house was a collage of their things and my memories were the only things left out. I tried to be patient, to be the man who keeps peace, but patience is a currency and I was running out of change. One night, after another dinner where I'd been reduced to background noise, I walked into my room and found a stack of her cousin's clothes on my chair, a half-eaten sandwich on my nightstand, and a note that said, "Thanks for letting us crash, bro." And something inside me that had been numb for months lit up like a flare. I didn't yell, I didn't break anything, I just took the note, folded it, and put it in the drawer where I kept the deed, like a reminder that permission had been given. Without my consent. That drawer became my altered papers, receipts, the deed, my father's watch, and every time I opened it I felt like I was opening a safe that held the last pieces of my dignity. I started leaving small marks, little acts of reclamation. I moved my father's picture back to the center of the shelf, I put my records where they belonged, I stopped leaving the spare key on the counter, and each small move felt like a stitch in a wound that had been left to fester. They noticed, of course. Her mom would raise an eyebrow, her cousin would make a joke, and she'd look at me with that look, confused, hurt, like I'd betrayed the family vibe, and I'd have to explain myself like a criminal defending a right to breathe. Conversations turned into negotiations. "Why you gotta be so uptight?" she'd say, and I'd answer, "Because this is my life," and the word "my" sounded foreign in my mouth, like I was reclaiming a language I'd been taught to forget. The house started to feel like a courtroom where I was always on trial, and the jury was stacked with people who'd never seen the nights I cried into my pillow, who'd never heard the prayers my mother whispered into the dark. I learned to watch for patterns: the way they'd arrive early, the way they'd linger late, the way they'd leave traces of themselves like breadcrumbs leading to a takeover. I learned to set small boundaries and hold them like a lifeline: no shoes in my room, not before entering, no keys left out, and when those boundaries were crossed I didn't explode, I enforced them, calmly, with the firmness that surprised even me. There was a night when her cousin came in with a group and started rearranging my records, laughing like he was curating a playlist for his followers, and I walked in, took the record from his hands, and said, "Put it back," and the room went quiet like someone had turned down the volume on the world. He smirked, tried to make a joke, but I didn't laugh, and the joke died on his lips because I'd stopped being the easy target. That moment didn't fix everything, but it shifted something. Respect is a currency too, and sometimes people only pay when they see you mean it. Still, the emotional cost was heavy. I'd lie awake thinking about the boy who used to build forts out of blankets, the son who believed his mother's prayers could protect him, and I'd mourn that kid like a person I'd lost to time. I started writing again, small notes, letters I never sent, pages where I poured out the things I couldn't say aloud, and those pages became a map of my survival. There were nights when I wanted to leave, to pack a bag and walk until the city swallowed me and I could start over, but leaving felt like admitting defeat, like handing them the victory of erasing me, and I wasn't ready to give them that. So I stayed and fought in quieter ways, by showing up, by paying bills, by keeping the house in my name, by refusing to let my voice be edited out of my own life. The battle changed me. I grew sharper, more deliberate, less willing to let people assume my consent. I learned to call things what they were: invasion, entitlement, manipulation, and naming them took away some of their power. There were moments of tenderness too small, fragile, when she'd catch me looking at a photo and sit down beside me, and for a second the house felt like it could be ours in the good way, not the takeover way, and I'd almost believe it, almost let my guard down, but then a cousin would text, a plan would be made, and the moment would evaporate like breath on a mirror. I started to understand that love and ownership are different things. You can love someone and still protect what's yours, and protecting what's yours doesn't make you selfish, it makes you whole. The walls kept listening, but I stopped whispering to them like a scared kid. I started speaking up, steady and clear, and even when my voice shook, it carried. People asked me later how I held on, how I didn't break, and I'd tell them the truth. I stayed because some things are worth the fight, because silence had cost me too much, because the house was more than wood and nails, it was the ledger of my life, and I wasn't about to let strangers write over it. She told me once, flat and quiet like a verdict, "You're a man, endure it," and those words landed in my chest like a stone thrown through glass, because they weren't just a sentence, they were a whole culture wrapped up in a shrug. Do your time, swallow your pride, keep the peace at the cost of your soul. And for a second I felt every lesson I'd been taught about masculinity pressed down on me, the old scripts about being strong, being silent, being the one who takes the blows without making a scene, and I realized how dangerous that script could be when the blows come from the people you love. I remember the night she said it. The house smelled like the curry her aunt had left behind, the TV was low, cousins' laughter still echoing down the hall, and I'd asked, calm but tired, "Can we set some boundaries? My room's my space," and she looked at me like I'd asked for the moon, like my request was a betrayal, and then she said it, "You're a man, endure it," and the room went cold. Endure it. Like a badge of honor, like suffering was noble, like my discomfort was a small price to pay for family harmony, and I sat there thinking about my dad, about the way he'd tighten his jaw and say nothing when the world pushed him, and I felt the weight of generations settle on my shoulders. But endurance ain't the same as surrender. There's a line between holding steady and letting yourself be erased, and that night I felt that line blur. I tried to explain his soft, measured, how the constant presence of other people in our home made me feel invisible, how my rituals, my quiet, my grief for my mom, were being smoothed over by other people's laughter, and she sighed, like I was being dramatic, and said, "You always make things heavy," and then, "You're a man, endure it," like it was a cure-all. I left the room and walked the block, the city lights like a scatter of promises I didn't trust, and I thought about endurance as a weapon as much as a virtue, how it can be used to keep someone small, to keep them from asking for what's theirs, to make them complicit in their own erasure. The next morning I woke up with a plan that wasn't loud but it was deliberate. Endurance without boundaries is surrender, so I'd endure with rules. I started small, no shoes in my room, not before entering, no keys left out, and I said them once, calmly, like a man who decided to stop apologizing for existing. She rolled her eyes, her mom tooted, cousins laughed it off, but the rules stuck like a new law in the house, and for a while it felt like I'd carved out a little island of me. But endurance has a cost. It makes you patient, it makes you strategic, it makes you watch and wait for the moment when people test the line, and they tested it hard. Her mom would come over with a smile and a casserole and then, like a tide, leave a presence that didn't go with the dish, opinions about how I should dress, how I should speak, how I should let the woman run the home, and every compliment was a leash. "You work so hard, Beta," she'd say, and the words were honeyed but they came with strings, gratitude that turned into permission to be everywhere. I started to notice the little manipulations, the way they'd frame my requests as unreasonable, the way they'd tell stories about me that made me look like the problem, and endurance felt less like strength and more like being gaslit into silence. There were nights I'd lie awake and count the ways I'd been taught to be a man, provider, protector, stoic, and wonder if those lessons were just armor or if they were a cage. I wrote in the margins of my notebooks, lines I never showed anyone, "Endure, but don't disappear," and those words became a mantra I whispered when the house got loud and my throat tightened. The turning point came when she said it again, sharper this time, in front of her cousin who'd been lounging on my couch like he'd paid rent. "You're a man, endure it," and the cousin laughed like it was a joke, but I felt something inside me break and then reassemble into something harder. I stood up, slow, and I said, "Endurance doesn't mean erasure. I'll endure, but I won't be erased," and the room went quiet like someone had muted the world. Her face shifted to surprise, then anger, then a hurt that looked almost like betrayal, and I realized she'd been using that phrase as a shield, a way to avoid the hard work of compromise. She accused me of being dramatic, of making mountains out of molehills, and I told her, steady, that the molehills were the map of my life, that each small thing they took was a piece of me, and I wasn't willing to lose myself for the sake of a smile. The conversation didn't end with fireworks, it ended with a cold distance that felt worse than any fight, because silence can be a weapon too. I started to see endurance as a negotiation. I'd give on some things, but I'd hold firm on the essentials: my room, my rituals, the wall with my mother's prayers, and I'd demand respect in return. That demand felt radical in a house where family was used like a legal claim, but I learned that respect isn't given because you're quiet, it's given because you insist on it. There were moments of tenderness, rare, fragile, when she'd catch me looking at an old photo and sit down beside me, and for a second the house felt like it could be ours in the good way, not the takeover way, and I'd almost believe it, almost let my guard down, but then a cousin would text, a plan would be made, and the moment would evaporate. I started to measure love differently. Love that asks you to disappear isn't love, it's convenience. I began to speak up more, not with rage but with clarity. I love you, but I won't lose myself. Saying it out loud felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a basement. People noticed the change. Her mom's compliments turned thin, the cousin's laughter got quieter, and she looked at me with a mix of admiration and resentment, like she was watching a man she thought she knew become someone else. Endurance didn't go away. Sometimes I still swallowed my pride to keep the peace, but it stopped being a blanket that smothered me. It became a tool I used on my terms. I learned to pick my battles, to enforce boundaries with calm repetition, to make the house a place where my presence mattered. The cost was high, friendships strained, family dinners got awkward, and there were nights I wondered if I'd made the right call, if I'd become the kind of man who chooses solitude over compromise. But then I'd sit against that wall with my mother's prayers humming in my bones, and I'd know I'd done the right thing. Endurance taught me patience, but it also taught me that patience without self-respect is just a slow surrender, and I refused to surrender. In the end, the phrase "you're a man, endure it" lost its power because I refused to let it define me. I endured, yes, but I endured with boundaries, with dignity, and with the quiet, stubborn insistence that my life, my house, my memories, my name on the deed was worth protecting. The day I finally pulled the papers out and laid them on the table felt like stepping into a courtroom where I was both defendant and judge, and I remember the light that afternoon, thin, honest, cutting across the kitchen like it wanted to witness everything, and I wanted the truth to have a witness too. I'd been carrying the deed like a secret talisman for months, the weight of it in my drawer a constant reminder that some things were mine because I bled for them, not because anyone handed them over, and the plan wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. I'd waited until the house was quiet, until the cousins had left and the laughter had thinned, until her mom had gone back to her own life, and then I sat her down at the table like a man who'd decided to stop letting the world edit his story. She looked at me with that look, soft, confused, like she was trying to read the weather on my face, and I could see the habit of her family's entitlement in the way her jaw tightened, the way she braced for a fight she thought she'd win. But I wasn't there to fight, I was there to reveal. I slid the papers across the table, the ink catching the light, my name printed in a way that felt like a signature on my life, and I watched her eyes move from the paper to me, searching for a trick, a joke, anything that would make the moment less real. "I bought this place," I said, voice steady, and the words landed like a verdict, simple and final, and for a second the room held its breath. She laughed first, a short, nervous sound, like she thought I was playing, but then she read the name and the laugh died, and I saw the gears shift in her head as she tried to reconcile the woman who'd been rearranging my life with the man who'd been quietly building it. Her mom called that night, voice syrupy, asking about plans, about renovations, and I could hear the surprise in her tone when I told her, calmly, that the house was mine, that the mortgage was in my name, that the nights I'd worked 2 jobs weren't a story to be rewritten, and the silence on the other end was a kind of thunder. It wasn't about flexing, it wasn't about proving anything to the world, it was about drawing a line so clear that even the foggiest of intentions couldn't cross it. I wanted them to know that this wasn't a negotiation, it was a boundary. She accused me of hiding things, of playing games, of not trusting her, and I told her the truth. I trusted her with my heart, not with the ledger of my life, and there's a difference between love and ownership that she hadn't learned yet. The first week after I revealed the deed was a study in small earthquakes, conversations that trembled, dinners that felt like interrogations, her cousins' visits that turned into reconnaissance missions where they'd come in smiling but leave with a new map of the house in their heads, and I watched it all like a man watching a slow-motion car crash, because I knew the reveal would change everything, and it did. People shifted their tone around me, some with respect, some with resentment, and I learned quickly who was there for me and who was there for the idea of me. Her mom's compliments turned thin, like paper cutouts of warmth, and sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a calculation that made my skin crawl, but other times neighbors who'd never said a word came by with a nod, a small acknowledgement that ownership carries weight. My wife's face was the hardest to read. Sometimes she looked proud, like she'd finally seen the man she married stand up, and sometimes she looked betrayed, like I'd kept a secret that should have been shared, and the contradiction in her eyes was a knife I carried with me. We argued, of course. There were nights when the house felt like a battlefield and our words were the artillery, but there were also nights when she'd sit beside me on the couch and rest her head on my shoulder and the house would feel like a fragile truce, like maybe we could be a team without erasing each other. The real battle wasn't with her though, it was with the idea that family entitlement could be normalized into your life until you didn't even notice the theft. I started to see the patterns, how compliments became expectations, how help became occupation, how our family was used like a legal claim to your privacy, and I decided to dismantle that quietly, with consistency. I changed the locks, not as a power move but as a reset. I put my father's picture back where it belonged, I rehung the prayer mat in the corner where my mom used to sit, and I started hosting dinners that were mine, small, intentional, with people who respected the lines I'd drawn. Her family pushed back, of course. They called me stubborn, accused me of being cold, and there were nights when her cousin would make a joke about the man of the house finally acting like it, and I'd smile, but inside I was counting the cost of every joke, every slight, every moment that tried to make me small. The deed on the table didn't stop the whispers, but it gave me a backbone. It made it harder for people to gaslight me into thinking I was the problem for wanting a room that belonged to me. There were consequences, relationships strained, holidays that used to be easy turned into negotiations, and sometimes I'd lie awake wondering if I'd made the right call, if I'd become the kind of man who chose solitude over compromise, but then I'd remember the nights I'd spent alone in that apartment before she moved in, the nights I'd whispered to the wall and felt my mother's prayers answer back, and I knew I'd done the right thing. The reveal forced conversations that had been simmering under the surface into the open. We had to talk about respect, about boundaries, about what partnership actually meant when two lives collide, and those talks were messy, raw, and sometimes brutal, but they were honest, and honesty is a currency that buys you a kind of peace you can't fake. She cried once, in the kitchen, hands on the counter, saying she felt excluded, that I'd kept her out of a part of my life, and I told her I was sorry for the secrecy but not for the boundary. Because some truths are heavy and you don't hand them over like party favors, you protect them until you know the person standing with you can hold them without breaking. Over time, the house settled into a new rhythm. The cousins still came, but they came with a different energy, a respect that had been earned, not assumed, and her mom's visits became less about planting flags and more about sharing meals. My wife and I rebuilt trust in a different language, less about shared ownership of things and more about shared respect for the things that made us who we were, and that shift changed the way we argued, the way we laughed, the way we planned. I didn't win every battle, and I still had nights where the old fears crept back in, where I'd catch myself watching the door like a man waiting for an invasion, but the deed on the table had done its work. It reminded me that some things are worth protecting, that silence can be a shield but truth is a sword, and that standing up for your life doesn't make you selfish, it makes you whole. People asked me later if I regretted keeping the secret for so long, and I tell them the truth. Regret is a complicated thing. I regret the nights I let fear keep me quiet, but I don't regret the moment I chose to reveal, because that reveal was the start of reclaiming my life, and sometimes the hardest thing you can do is show the world the parts of you you've been hiding. Because once they're out in the light you can either let them be stolen or you can hold them tighter than ever. The night everything changed came slow, like a storm you feel in your bones before the sky even darkens, and I remember the little things, the way the kettle whistled on the stove, the way her laugh bounced down the hall, the way the apartment smelled like spices and someone else's perfume, and I knew the moment was coming because the air had been charged for weeks, small tensions stacking like plates until the pile was too tall to steady, and that night the plates fell. She'd been distant all day, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful but plotting, and when she finally sat across from me at the table her hands were steady but her eyes were glassy, like someone who'd rehearsed a speech and now had to deliver it for real, and she said, soft, "We need to talk about the future," and I felt my stomach drop because future in her mouth had always meant plans that didn't include my past, and I braced. She started with small things, colors, curtains, the idea of moving the prayer mat to a corner so it fits the aesthetic, and I let her talk, because I'd learned that arguing at the wrong time only made you look unhinged, but then she slid into the part I'd been dreading, her voice got steady, practiced, and she said, "I think it's time we make this house feel like ours, fully," and the word fully landed like a verdict. I told her, calm but firm, that some things weren't negotiable, that the wall, the prayer mat, the corner where my father's picture hung, those were anchors, not decor, and she looked at me like I'd named a superstition, like I was clinging to ghosts, and then she said something that cut deeper than any insult, "You're choosing your past over our life," and in that moment I realized the fight wasn't just about objects, it was about identity, about whether I'd be allowed to keep the parts of me that made me whole. The conversation spiraled, not into shouting at first but into a cold, surgical dissection of who we were to each other. She accused me of being closed off, of not letting her family in, of being selfish, and I accused her of erasing me, of letting other people's voices drown out mine, and the words we threw at each other were sharp and precise, like knives honed on years of small resentments. Her mom called in the middle of it, voice syrupy, asking if everything was okay. And I could hear the judgment in the pauses, the way she'd already decided the narrative, husband unreasonable, daughter patient, and I felt the walls of the house close in, like I was trapped in a story someone else had written. I stood up then, not to leave but to show I wasn't shrinking, and I walked to the wall I'd refused to tear down and ran my hand along the plaster like I was checking for the pulse of my life, and she followed me, eyes burning, and said, "If you won't let go, then maybe you don't want this life with me." And that line hit like a grenade because it wasn't just a threat, it was an ultimatum, choose me or choose your ghosts. I thought about my mom's hands, the way she'd fold her palms and whisper for protection, the way she'd tell me to stand firm, and I felt that old prayer rise up in me like a shield, and I said, "Steady, I chose you when I married you, but I didn't sign away my history, my name, my blood," and she laughed, a short, bitter sound, like someone had been betrayed by a promise she'd made to herself, and she said, "You always make it about you," and I realized then that she'd been taught to see boundaries as selfishness, to equate ownership with greed, and that lesson had been fed to her by a family that mistook presence for belonging. The night stretched long, words ricocheting off the ceiling, and at some point the argument turned into a map of our differences, how she saw family as a net that caught everyone, how I saw family as a set of lines that protected what mattered, and neither of us could translate the other's language. She accused me of hiding things, of keeping secrets, and I told her the truth. I kept the deed because I was scared of losing everything I'd built, because I'd watched people take and never give back, and because some parts of a man's life are sacred and not meant for public auction. She cried then, not the soft tears of someone hurt but the hot, angry kind that comes when you feel betrayed, and she said, "You made decisions without me," and I said, "I made decisions to protect what I thought would protect us," and the irony of that sentence wasn't lost on either of us. The argument ended not with a slammed door but with a quiet that felt like a verdict. She packed a bag that night, not in a dramatic storm but with the slow, efficient movements of someone who'd rehearsed leaving in their head 1,000 times, and when she walked out the door the apartment felt like a stage after the actors had left, empty, echoing, and full of the traces of what had just happened. I sat on the couch, the wall behind me steady and cold, and I felt a loneliness that wasn't just about being alone but about the way love can fracture when two people bring different maps to the same place. Days after she left were a blur of calls, her mom's voice sharp, her cousin's messages full of thinly veiled triumph, neighbors whispering like they were watching a soap opera, but there were also quiet moments where the house felt like it had exhaled, like the pressure had been released and I could finally breathe. And in those moments I walked the rooms and touched the things she'd tried to change and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I missed her, of course. I missed the small rituals, the way she'd hum while she cooked, the way she'd leave notes on the fridge, but I also felt a fierce clarity, like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through for years. Friends told me to fight, to call her back, to beg, but I knew this wasn't a battle won by noise. It was a test of whether we could rebuild with respect, whether she could see that protecting your past doesn't mean you don't want a future with someone, and whether I could soften without surrendering. Weeks passed, and she came back once, eyes rimmed red, and we talked, not the shouting matches of before but the slow, careful conversations of people trying to learn a new language of compromise. She said she felt excluded, I said I felt erased, and we both admitted things we'd been too proud to say before, and in that fragile honesty there was a chance, a small, trembling possibility that we could stitch the house back together without cutting out the parts that made us who we were. But the truth is, some cracks leave scars, and even if you mend them the pattern stays, a reminder of what broke and how it was fixed, and I learned that love sometimes asks you to choose between comfort and truth, between easy peace and the harder work of respect. I chose the harder work, not because I wanted to be right but because I wanted to be whole, and in the quiet that followed I started to rebuild, not just the apartment, but the version of myself that could hold both love and boundaries, that could be tender without being erased, that could endure without disappearing, and that, more than anything, felt like a man finally learning how to live in his own skin. *** Considering users request ***. The user has been saying 10 multiple times, and I think they might be asking for part 10, especially since they listed 10 headings earlier. The final chapter is part 10, titled I Survived, but something shattered inside me. They've also mentioned they prefer direct responses, so I'll skip asking and just go ahead and write part 10. I'll make sure it's one continuous paragraph, raw and emotional, with USA slang, and no repeated questions. I'll follow the system rules for formatting too. I survived, but something inside me cracked and never quite glued back the same way, and I can still feel the fracture when the house gets quiet and the night presses its palm against the window, because surviving ain't the same as being whole. Surviving is a ledger of losses you tally in the dark while the world thinks you're fine, and I learned that the hard way, after the fights, after the reveal, after the night she left and came back and left again. I kept the keys, I kept the deed, I kept the wall with my mother's prayers, but I lost pieces of myself in the process. Small things at first, like the way I used to laugh without checking if it sounded acceptable, the way I used to leave my records out without thinking someone would judge the taste, the way I used to sleep without listening for footsteps, and those small things added up until I woke up one morning and realized I was a man who'd learned to survive by shrinking, by making myself less interesting, less complicated, less worthy of being stolen, and that shrinking left a hollow where my joy used to live. People tell you survival is strength, they clap when you stand after a fall, but they don't see the quiet inventory you keep of what you gave up to stand, the friendships you let fade because you didn't have the energy to explain, the hobbies you shelved because the house needed policing, the late-night writing that turned into notes you never sent, and I'd sit against that wall and press my palm to the plaster and feel the echo of my mother's voice like a bandage and wonder if surviving was worth the price. There were days when the house felt like a museum of my compromises, photos rearranged, cushions replaced, the prayer mat tucked into a corner like an artifact, and I'd walk through it like a visitor in my own life, cataloging what remained mine and what had been repurposed into someone else's story, and sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at a joke I didn't find funny just to keep the peace, and that smile would taste like metal in my mouth because it was payment for silence. I learned to be strategic. I kept the deed visible, I paid the bills on time, I hosted dinners that were mine in tone and guest list, I put my father's picture back where it belonged, and those acts stitched a border around my life, but the stitches left scars, habits of suspicion, a reflex to check the locks twice, a tendency to rehearse conversations before I spoke, a fear that any kindness might be a Trojan horse for more erasure, and the people who loved me sometimes mistook those scars for coldness, for distance, and I'd have to explain that the distance was a fence, not a wall, that I'd built it to keep the parts of me that mattered from being trampled. Love didn't disappear, it changed shape. There were mornings when she'd make coffee and the smell would pull me back to the early days when we were a team, and for a second the house would feel like it could be ours in the good way, not the takeover way, and I'd almost let my guard down, almost believe we could be tender without losing ourselves. But then a cousin would text, a plan would be made, and the tenderness would evaporate like steam, leaving me with the memory of what could have been and the reality of what was. I forgave, not because I was weak but because forgiveness was the only way to keep living in the same space without turning every meal into a tribunal, and forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing to move forward with eyes open, to rebuild trust on terms that included respect for my history, and that rebuilding was slow and messy and required both of us to learn a new language, one where boundaries weren't betrayals and where family didn't mean entitlement. Some nights I'd wake up and the house would be silent and I'd realize I'd been holding my breath for years, waiting for the next invasion, and the release of that breath felt like grief and relief at once, grief for the boy who used to build forts and believe in simple prayers, relief that I'd finally stopped letting people rearrange my life without asking. I started writing again, not to hide but to heal, pages full of the small things I'd been taught to swallow, letters to the versions of myself I'd misplaced, poems that sounded like confessions, and those pages became a map back to me. Friends noticed the change, some pulled away because my boundaries made them uncomfortable, others leaned in because they respected the man who'd chosen himself, and the ones who stayed were the ones who mattered, people who didn't demand my silence as proof of love. There were nights when I'd catch myself laughing at a memory and then stop, because the laugh felt foreign, like a muscle I hadn't used in years, and I'd have to coax it back with small joys, cooking a meal my mom used to make, spinning a record and letting the music fill the room, walking the block and letting the city remind me I existed outside that apartment, and those small joys were the glue that slowly mended the fracture. But some things never fully healed. There's a part of me that's always alert now, a part that measures the room before it relaxes, a part that keeps a list of boundaries in the back pocket of my mind. And that part is both blessing and burden because it keeps me safe but also keeps me from being reckless in the way that makes life bright. I learned to be honest about the cost of surviving. I'd tell people, I made it through, but I paid, and they'd nod like they understood, but understanding is a shallow pool unless you've walked the road yourself, unless you've counted the small losses and still decided to stand. In the end, surviving taught me a new kind of courage, the courage to be tender and firm at the same time, to love without losing the ledger of who I was, to protect the sacred without turning my life into a fortress, and to admit that being whole is a process, not a destination. I still press my palm to that wall sometimes, not to beg it to hold me but to remind myself that the prayers carved into it are part of me, that my mother's voice lives in the plaster and in my bones, and that surviving didn't erase her or me, it changed us into something more complicated, more wary, more real. If you ask me if I regret the fights, the reveals, the nights I chose to stand instead of fold, I'll tell you this, I don't regret protecting what was mine, but I mourn the parts one lost along the way, and I carry those losses like a ledger I consult when I make new choices, because surviving taught me that the cost of peace is sometimes too high unless you pay it on your own terms, and I choose now to pay it with dignity, with boundaries, and with the stubborn hope that the next chapter of my life will be less about surviving and more about living.